At 79, the tragedy of Diane Keaton is beyond heartbreaking. Cinema is in mourning. The gold has drained from its lights, the applause has thinned to a hush, and somewhere in a quiet California room on October 11, 2025, a final gentle breath slipped away. Diane Keaton, one of Hollywood's rarest lights, has gone, leaving an industry and a generation reaching for a presence that suddenly isn't there. How do you farewell the woman who made you feel seen in your loneliest hour? The shock froze the world in place. The ache she leaves behind is not confined to her family, but lives in the bones of millions who once recognized themselves in her laughter and found courage in her candor. For more than 5 decades, she was not simply an actress. She was an era. Keaton shattered the neat borders of what a leading woman could be, bending femininity into something truer, stranger, braver. Through The Godfather and Annie Hall, she rewrote the grammar of love and pain, on-screen proof that imperfection could be incandescent. Quirky, fearless, insistently human, she became the quiet heartbeat of a golden Hollywood that believed character mattered more than gloss. Today, the screens still glow, but the room feels colder. A monument hasn't just cracked, it has fallen. Yet the story of Diane Keaton does not end with mourning. It begins with a thread few dared to pull, because behind the smile that steadied generations ran a seam of solitude, sacrifice, and a truth Hollywood never managed to frame. But the darkest secret was yet to be revealed. Would you like me to continue with the next part? To understand Diane Keaton, you must first understand the paradox. She lived inside a woman who made the world laugh while quietly dissecting her own heartbreak. Born in Los Angeles on January 5, 1946, she grew up in a city obsessed with perfection, a place where the light was always staged and emotions were something to be hidden behind foundation and smiles. Her father, Jack Hall, a gentle civil engineer, believed that order was love. Her mother, Dorothy Diane Keaton Hall, once crowned Mrs. Los Angeles, 1955, had been a dreamer herself, a woman who longed for the stage but surrendered that dream to family life. In the Hall household, appearances mattered. Grace before dinner, laughter reserved for guests, and silence, the kind that seeps into walls, was the family's true language. Diane once said, "I grew up in a house that didn't talk about feelings. We just lived inside them." That quiet ache became the pulse of her art. She learned early that pain, if shaped carefully, could become beauty, and that silence, when handled right, could sing louder than any dialogue. By the time she reached adolescence, Diane had already recognized the great tragedy of her mother's life. Not that she failed, but that she stopped trying. She watched Dorothy's light fade from ambition into routine, from theater lights into kitchen lamps. The applause was replaced by the soft clatter of dishes, and standing in that doorway, 9 years old, Diane made herself a silent promise: "I will not live my mother's life." That vow became her compass. While the other girls of the 1950s dreamed of white fences and Sunday husbands, Diane dreamed of escape, of scripts, stages, and lights that would not go out when she turned her back. Teachers called her unruly. Classmates called her strange. But she wasn't strange. She was becoming herself. Her rebellion was quiet but volcanic. Beneath the polite girl facade was a soul already writing its first monologue about survival. And when the spotlight first found her in high school, trembling awkward, performing Blanche de Bois, she later recalled, "That was the first time I felt seen. It wasn't acting. It was survival." From that moment on, the trajectory was set. The child who had learned to translate silence into meaning was already scripting the legend of Diane Keaton, a woman who would teach the world that imperfection could be divine, that vulnerability could be power, and that solitude could be a kind of love. But the story of how she built herself from silence had only just begun. The home where Diane Keaton grew up looked ordinary: sunlight pouring through the lace curtains, a father who paid the bills, a mother who smiled for the neighbors. But beneath the veneer of suburban grace was a quiet war between what life demanded and what the heart desired. Her mother, Dorothy, was a woman built from light who had once wanted to act, to stand beneath the warmth of a stage and hear her name ripple through a crowd. But that dream, like a photograph left too long in the sun, faded slowly. Diane watched it vanish. Every year another curtain fell. First the stage makeup tucked away, then the scripts, then the voice. Dorothy became a ghost of her own ambition apron instead of costume applause, replaced by the clatter of pans. Diane's young eyes memorized every surrender, every small extinguishing of self. I realized my mother's life was a warning, not a map she would write decades later. It was there in that quiet house of unspoken feelings that the actress was born, not out of joy but out of resistance. Diane's rebellion didn't arrive as shouting, it arrived as imagination. She filled the silence with stories reenacting kitchen dramas, with stuffed animals rewriting endings, where the woman didn't stay quiet, where she didn't fade. By the time she reached high school, that defiance had turned to fire. In school plays, she trembled and shone all at once. Her first real role, Blanche Dubois, in A Streetcar Named Desire, wasn't a performance. It was prophecy. She said later, "That was the first time I felt seen. It wasn't pretending, it was surviving." After graduation, the future seemed to pull her by the collar. The Los Angeles sun that had once felt warm now felt suffocating. So at just 20 years old, she packed her dreams, her mother's maiden name Keaton, and a handful of worn scripts, and boarded a bus headed for New York City. The Greyhound rumbled through desert and dusk, carrying a girl who had decided she would rather starve for her dream than live comfortably without it. Every mile east was a mile further from silence, but she didn't yet know that silence would follow her, stalking her through alleys and auditions, turning into the one companion she could never quite escape. And in the heart of New York's cold, Diane Keaton's legend would begin not with applause, but with hunger. New York, 1966. The city didn't welcome Diane Keaton. It tested her. The winter wind bit through her thin coat as she stepped off the Greyhound, a single suitcase in hand, the skyline rising like a dare. She rented a small apartment on the Upper West Side, the wallpaper peeling, the radiator coughing instead of heating. At night, she could hear her neighbors arguing through the walls, their pain blending with her own. She enrolled at the neighborhood playhouse, where actors were told to strip away everything false. For Diane, that wasn't hard. She had never known how to fake. But truth, as she would soon learn, didn't pay rent. Days were auditions that ended before they began. Too tall, too strange, not the type. The rejections clung to her like frost. By noon, she was a waitress at a diner where no one remembered her name. By night, she sang in smoke-filled basements, her trembling voice barely rising above the hum of conversation. Sometimes she sang for tips, sometimes just to remind herself that she was still real. When the cold became unbearable, she'd walk through the city just to stay warm, whispering to herself, "Not yet." She later said, "Fear became my engine." That fear carried her through the weeks of hunger and months of silence. She pawned her shoes to pay rent, skipped the subway to afford coffee, and wrote dialogue by candlelight when the power was cut. Every night, she fell asleep still wearing her coat. The city was deafening, but for Diane, the real torture was not being heard. Then, in 1968, after 2 years of rejection, she got a call that changed everything, a Broadway revival of Hair. The director wanted someone raw, unpolished, someone real. Diane walked into the audition barefoot, her voice trembling, her heart louder than her words. She didn't perform, she confessed. When she finished, the room was silent. Then softly, the director said, "Don't change a thing." That night, she stood under the stage lights barefoot again, the heat burning through her fear. As the music swelled, something inside her cracked open, the silence of her childhood finally breaking into sound. The audience didn't see perfection, they saw truth, and that truth would become the signature of her entire career. Years later, she would say, "I built myself out of fear." It wasn't poetry, it was fact. Every rejection became a brick, Every hungry night became a lesson in survival, and every lonely walk through the snow became a rehearsal for greatness. Long before the Oscar, before the Godfather, before the world called her extraordinary, there was just a girl walking through the cold with empty pockets and a spirit that refused to freeze. And that's where the legend began, not in glory, but in grit. The snow of New York melted into spotlight. The silence that once defined Diane Keaton's life was now replaced by the thunder of applause. By the early 1970s, she had become a face everyone recognized, but few truly understood. Her breakout came with The Godfather in 1972, a film that didn't just introduce her to the world, it legitimized her. As Kay Adams, the quiet conscience beside Al Pacino's Michael Corleone, she carried every unspoken question about loyalty, morality, and love. The film gave her more than fame. It gave her the voice she had been fighting for since childhood. Then in 1977 came the film that would turn that voice into an anthem, Annie Hall. It wasn't a character, it was her reflection. The laugh, the hesitations, the turtlenecks, the vulnerability. Every bit of Diane was right there on screen. Woody Allen may have directed it, but she was it. The world fell in love not with an idea of a woman, but with a woman being unapologetically herself. That year, she stood under the blinding light of the Academy Awards, clutching the golden statue with trembling hands. Best Actress, they said. 31 years old, dressed in her signature men's blazer, she looked more like a question than an icon. When she went home that night, the applause still ringing in her ears, she placed the Oscar on her kitchen counter, stared at it for a long moment, and whispered, "Is this what it feels like to be seen?" But every spotlight cast a shadow. The higher she climbed, the thinner the air became. Each new role came with the unspoken terror of comparison. Can you ever be that good again? Fame, as she soon learned, had its own weather, beautiful, brutal, unpredictable. On set, Diane was relentless. She worked until her voice cracked, until her body trembled. Between takes, she hid in dressing rooms, rewriting scenes no one asked her to change, chasing a perfection that didn't exist. "I didn't sleep," she once admitted. "I was scared to stop." Her laughter, once spontaneous, became rehearsed. The woman the world adored for her ease was quietly unraveling under the weight of expectation. There were nights she'd drive through Los Angeles with the windows down, letting the cold air sting her face, whispering to herself, "Remember who you were before all this." And yet, even in that fragile space between creation and collapse, Diane never lost her honesty. She carried imperfection like a torch. Through every line, every nervous pause, every tilt of her head, she reminded the world that truth was more magnetic than beauty. By the early 1980s, she wasn't just a movie star. She was a movement, Hollywood's darling of sincerity, the woman who made awkwardness iconic and vulnerability cinematic. Every frame she touched seemed to pulse with authenticity. But just as her fame reached its highest point, something began to fracture beneath the surface, a quiet dissonance between the woman the world adored and the one who stared back at her in the mirror. Because even legends have limits, and hers was about to be tested in ways no camera could capture. Fame can be a throne and a cage. For Diane Keaton, the applause that once lifted her began to sound like a storm she could no longer stand in. The 1980s brought success, but it was the kind that drained rather than fed her. When she starred in Reds in 1981, directed by her longtime partner, Warren Beatty, she gave everything: her heart, her mind, her exhaustion. The performance was incandescent, yet when the cameras stopped rolling, she confessed, "I cried in my car, not because I was sad, but because I had nothing left to give." That sentence captured the essence of her tragedy, brilliance that cost her pieces of herself. When The Little Drummer Girl was released in 1984, it was meant to be her next triumph, a psychological thriller bold and complex. Instead, it faltered. Critics were indifferent, the box office colder still. For a woman who had just rewritten cinematic history, the stumble was devastating. "Everyone thought I was still on top," she would later recall, "but inside, I was slipping." So she vanished. not out of failure but fatigue. She turned down million-dollar roles. She stopped chasing Hollywood's love because she realized it had never truly been hers. While the city that once worshipped her moved on to newer faces, Diane retreated into silence, the same silence that had once created her. In that quiet, she began to understand the true cost of her art. Success had made her visible, but it had also left her hollow. The woman who could fill any screen now found herself surrounded by empty rooms. "I used to think success would make me whole," she said, "but maybe it just gave me permission to be broken in public." It was then in the cracks between fame and loneliness that she faced her most haunting chapter: love, the kind of love that defined her and destroyed her in equal measure. His name was Al Pacino, her co-star in The Godfather, her mirror, her undoing. Their connection wasn't loud. It was electric in its restraint. Two souls who recognized in each other the same ache for meaning. She once confessed, "I was crazy about him from the start." But Pacino was a man haunted by his own distance, a genius who kept the world at arm's length, including her. Their love lingered across decades on screen and off. It was a dance between desire and denial, a tenderness forever, one confession away from peace. And when years later in Rome, she finally asked marriage or goodbye, he met her silence with silence. That night, she packed her bags, folded her dreams, and left before dawn. Outside, the Roman sky bruised into gold. She didn't cry. She simply stopped waiting. Days later, the phone rang. Her father, Jack Hall, had collapsed, a brain tumor. While she was mourning one love, she began losing another. "That's when I broke," she said years later. Not loudly, just quietly broke. Hospitals, funerals, long drives in silence. Diane Keaton, who once gave the world permission to laugh, now struggled to remember what laughter felt like. The grief wasn't theatrical. It was quiet, cumulative, merciless. But what makes tragedy unbearable is not just loss, it's endurance. Diane survived it all, even when survival meant reinventing herself from the ruins. Out of heartbreak, she built resilience. Out of loneliness, she built art. She once told a young actress, "The applause fades, but the work, that's what saves you." And so she worked, she wrote, she directed, she mothered. She began rebuilding a life not out of fame, but out of meaning. Yet even as she healed, there was always a shadow behind the laughter, a faint tremor in her voice, a trace of what she had lost. Because some loves never end. They just change shape and follow you into every role you play. By the time the 1990s arrived, Hollywood had already begun writing elegies for Diane Keaton's era, yet she refused to fade. While others chased youth through surgery and spectacle, Diane embraced age with the same defiant grace she had carried all her life. The woman who once trembled under stage lights now walked through the twilight of her fame unafraid. In her 50s, she began a new act not on screen, but at home. In 1996, she adopted her daughter Dexter, and 5 years later, her son Duke. She often said, "They saved me. I thought I was done with love." Then they arrived, and everything began again. The once silent house in Brentwood filled with the sounds of life music, laughter, the scraping of crayons across kitchen tables. She built tree houses instead of sets, packed lunches instead of suitcases, but the echoes of loss never fully left. She still carried the ghost of her father and the quiet ache of a love that never found its ending. In interviews, she laughed brightly, but her eyes held a kind of distance, as though part of her was always somewhere else remembering. "You don't recover from heartbreak," she said, "once you just learn how to walk with it." In her 60s, health began to test her resolve. Years of working through exhaustion had left her body weary. There were whispered hospital stays, minor surgeries, and moments of weakness she refused to publicize. Diane would joke to friends, "I've survived every script they gave me, even the one called aging." But those close to her noticed the slowing pace, the way she moved carefully through her home, her voice softer, her laugh smaller but truer. She found new comfort in solitude, spending her mornings in the garden of her Brentwood estate, where the lavender grew wild and forgiving. Each dawn she'd walk barefoot through the dew, coffee in hand, whispering to the trees, "You're still here. So am I." She turned her focus to architecture and restoration, buying, rebuilding, and rescuing old homes across California. "I love buildings the way some people love people," she said. "You can save them." And perhaps that was the truth of her later life. She could save everything but herself from time. By her 70s, Diane had become Hollywood's quiet matriarch, a woman who had nothing left to prove and everything left to feel. Her appearances grew rare, her interviews fewer, yet when she did appear, audiences saw the same radiant spark, older, gentler, but still defiantly alive. She spoke of mortality without fear. "I used to think being alone was a punishment," she said, "but maybe it's just another form of peace." The world didn't know it then, but she was preparing for her final role, the one without script or camera, the one every great artist faces in the end, because even legends must take their final bow, and hers would come as quietly as she lived her truth. When the news of Diane Keaton's passing broke, it wasn't just another Hollywood obituary, it was the closing of a chapter in cinema's emotional vocabulary. The headline spoke of an icon, a national treasure, but none of those words felt big enough. What she truly gave the world was permission to be imperfect, to be eccentric, to be real in an industry that worshipped illusion. For over 5 decades, she had been the mirror through which generations of women saw themselves, not polished or perfected, but honest. She made awkwardness graceful, turned self-doubt into charm, and transformed vulnerability into strength. "She made us feel seen," one fan wrote, and that might have been the truest tribute of all. Her influence seeped far beyond the screen. She redefined femininity, not through rebellion, but through authenticity. She wore men's suits and wide-brimmed hats, not as costume, but as armor. Fashion houses studied her. Actresses imitated her cadence, her wit, her refusal to be anything other than entirely human. Anne Hathaway once said Diane made it okay for women to be brilliant and strange. Emma Stone called her a compass for courage. In architecture, she became a visionary, buying and restoring historic homes across Los Angeles, treating buildings like living diaries of the people who once loved them. Every tile, every window, every bit of woodwork was an act of devotion. "Preserve what's good," she often said, whether it's a building, a mind, or a heart. But it was her spirit, not her style, that endured most powerfully. She taught that solitude was not loneliness, that aging could be luminous, that love could exist without possession. Her laughter, preserved across 1,000 interviews and films, still carried that unmistakable warmth, a mix of irony, wonder, and something deeper, a woman who had known loss but refused to stop finding joy. To her fans, she wasn't just an actress. She was proof that fragility could coexist with fearlessness. To her peers, she was a friend who never performed friendship. To her children, Dexter and Duke, she was home. In death as in life, Diane Keaton left quietly, but her silence echoed like scripture. She had once said, "Acting isn't pretending, it's confessing." And that's what she did for 6 decades. She confessed her humanity to a world desperate to remember its own. Her legacy wasn't fame, it was freedom. Freedom to be flawed, to be unfinished, to be alive. And that's why she will never truly fade. Because the truest stars don't burn out. They dissolve into the light, and the light stays. There are legends whose brilliance blinds us, and then there are souls like Diane Keaton, whose light feels like home. She never courted controversy, never needed scandal to stay relevant. Her fame was earned, not constructed. Her artistry carved from the quiet rebellion of being herself in a world that constantly demanded performance. At Celebrity Forgotten, we see her story not as a tragedy alone, but as a profound human arc, a reminder that the greatest battles are often invisible. Diane's power was never in perfection. It was in the tremor of her voice, the quirk of her smile, the hesitation before a laugh. She showed us that beauty isn't about control, it's about courage. Every Hollywood generation has its muse, but Diane was something rarer, a mirror. She reflected back the insecurities we hide, the longing we never confess, and the absurd hope that life still holds wonder, even after it breaks our hearts. Her choices, both personal and artistic, were often misunderstood, but in those contradictions, fear and fearlessness, loneliness and grace, she became timeless. It's easy to glorify her films, her fashion, her flawless performances, yet her true greatness lies in what she endured, the long silences between scripts, the loves that slipped away, the courage to age publicly in an industry terrified of wrinkles and truth. She taught us that solitude could be sacred and that heartbreak doesn't end. It simply teaches you to live with an open wound. Some will remember her for Annie Hall, some for The Godfather, others for her hats and laughter. But those who look closer will see something deeper, a woman who turned every fracture into art, every silence into a voice that still echoes long after the applause has faded. Diane Keaton's story reminds us that fame is fleeting, but authenticity is immortal, and in a world drowning in spectacle, her gentleness might be the most radical thing she ever gave us, because what remains after Diane isn't loss, it's the permission she gave us all to be human. There's something haunting about silence after a life like Diane Keaton's. The world feels slightly dimmer, as if even the sunlight remembers her. The camera has stopped rolling, yet the echo of her laughter still lingers, soft, defiant, unwilling to disappear. Somewhere in Brentwood, the wind brushes against the lavender she planted, and it's easy to imagine her there, coffee in hand, hat tilted just so, watching the morning light spill across the garden she built with her own hands. For more than half a century, Diane gave the world her truth, raw, awkward, luminous. She wasn't playing characters. She was documenting the fragile poetry of being human. Every frame she touched became a confession, every role a piece of her unfinished letter to the world. She made imperfection sacred. She made solitude beautiful. She made honesty a revolution. Now, the woman who once feared being alone has become part of the very stillness she spent her life translating into art. Perhaps that's the truest kind of immortality, not fame, not fortune, but the quiet persistence of memory. Every time someone stumbles upon her films and smiles at her offbeat laugh, every time a young woman dares to be unapologetically herself, Diane lives again. Some say legends fade, but some simply change form into whispers, into light, into the way we look at ourselves a little more gently. Diane Keaton didn't just act, she reminded us how to feel. And maybe as her story settles into history, that's what she wanted all along, not applause, but understanding. Not perfection, but presence, because some stories were never meant to be forgotten. Some souls were never meant to vanish. Some stories were never meant to be known. But now you know.